February 12th, 1945. The wooded hills near Epernay, France. The air was brittle with cold, thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder. On a ridge blanketed in frost, a young American sniper lay flat against the frozen ground. His name was Jack "Red" Bighgam, 22 years old, of the 4th Infantry Division. His breath fogged in short bursts as he peered through a scope that didn't belong on any regulation rifle because it wasn't. It was his own creation. A patchwork of scavenged parts, the lens of a broken Bausch and Lomb microscope, the steel ring from a dismantled German artillery fuse, and adjustment dials marked by hand with pencil notches. To his fellow soldiers, it was a joke, a science project, they said, a toy that would get him killed. But Jack didn't argue. He never did. He just tightened the bolts, wiped the lens clean, and went back to work. For him, this wasn't about pride. It was survival, the only way to see farther, shoot straighter, and make sense of a battlefield that didn't wait for perfect equipment. 3 days earlier, his unit, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to advance through a narrow valley north of the Bois de Laine Ridge. The German lines were dug in deep, armor-supported, and nearly invisible in the fog. The division had taken heavy losses in the Ardennes and was running short on scopes. Out of hundreds of rifles, only 3 had optics left intact. Jack refused to settle for that. He'd been a mechanic and watch repairman before the war, a man with steady hands and the patience to work in micrometers. He understood precision. He understood that when a machine failed, you didn't complain, you fixed it. Now, on that icy afternoon, he waited. His rifle, a standard Springfield M1903, a 4 rested against a sandbag, the improvised scope gleaming faintly under the gray light. Down in the valley, a German Panzer IV idled among the trees, its exhaust coughing steam into the winter air. The distance, 1,200 yards, nearly 3/4 of a mile. Too far for a normal shot, too absurd for anyone else to even try. The men beside him whispered. "He's insane," someone muttered. Another laughed. "That toy of his won't even scratch the paint." Jack didn't answer. He measured the wind, adjusted for drift, and exhaled slowly. The world seemed to narrow to a single line, 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 target. The trigger broke like glass. A heartbeat later, the valley erupted in flame. And just like that, the laughter stopped. The explosion echoed through the valley like thunder trapped inside steel. A column of smoke rose where the Panzer IV had been black, twisting, alive. The crew didn't stand a chance. 1 man stumbled from the hatch, his uniform aflame. Another tried to climb out before the tank's ammunition cooked off, blasting the turret skyward in a flash of orange and white. From the opposite ridge, the American soldiers who had once mocked Jack stared in stunned silence. No artillery, no air support, just a single shot from a rifle they had all laughed at. Within seconds, disbelief turned to awe. Someone whispered, That was Bighgam." No one replied. There was nothing to say. But for Jack, there was no celebration. He stayed motionless, face buried in the dirt, eyes locked on the burning wreck. He had seen what war did to men, how a victory could turn to ashes before the echo faded. When he finally lowered his rifle, his hands trembled, not from fear but from the cold seeping through the frozen soil. That moment wasn't luck. It was the result of weeks of obsession. 2 months earlier, when the Battle of the Bulge had ravaged the Ardennes, his unit was short on equipment, exhausted and freezing. Resupply lines were broken, and field optics were nearly non-existent. Many soldiers relied on iron sights, hopeless against the fog and distance of the French woods. Jack had seen the problem. He hadn't asked permission to fix it. He simply started to build. He visited a ruined field hospital on the outskirts of Epernay and found what he needed: a cracked Bausch and Lomb microscope, its lens tube intact. Using the steel ring of a destroyed German 88mm shell, he made a mounting bracket. Nights were his workshop. Beneath a torn tent, wrapped in blankets, he soldered the joints with scavenged wire and melted brass. The smell of metal and oil filled the air while the others slept. When he showed it to his squad, they burst out laughing. "Hey, doctor," one joked. "You gonna diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut?" Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe both," he said. Even his sergeant dismissed it. "Ain't regulation, kid. Don't come crying when it shatters." Well, but Jack didn't build it for approval. He built it because no one else would. The lens was bluish, imperfect, and scratched easily. The reticle, a thin strand of wire stripped from a field telephone, wasn't even centered perfectly, but it worked. It magnified. It aligned. And it gave him something no one else in the company had: a chance to see beyond the fog. On those cold February nights, while others warmed their hands by the fire, Jack practiced. He set up rusted helmets on fence posts, pacing backward into the woods. 200 yards. 400. 600. Each time, he noted the drift, the fall, the way the scope responded to cold air. He learned its flaws until they became strengths. He learned patience until it became instinct. So when the order came to scout the ridge above WWII, he was ready not with the best weapon, but with the one he'd built himself. And now, staring at the smoke curling skyward from a burning tank, Jack understood something simple and eternal: that sometimes, in war as in life, the difference between ridicule and respect is just one shot, the one nobody believes you can make. When the last echo faded, silence reclaimed the forest. Jack Bighgam lay still for a long time, his cheek pressed to the cold steel of his Springfield rifle. He didn't move, didn't speak. Only the faint hiss of burning fuel filled the valley. Through the bluish tint of his makeshift scope, he watched the German soldiers scramble in confusion, some shouting orders, others diving for cover, trying to understand what had just happened. No one could have imagined that a single bullet, fired from nearly 1,200 yards, could destroy a tank. But Jack had imagined it. He'd rehearsed it in his mind for nights, tracing angles, calculating wind drift, memorizing every weak point on a Panzer IV. He hadn't aimed for armor. That was suicide. He had aimed for the fuel intake cap, a small metal circle near the rear deck, where the crew often refueled in haste. He knew one spark there could turn the tank into a furnace. And now, as the flames grew higher, he realized he had been right. When dawn finally broke over the hills, the American camp buzzed with rumors. "Did you hear about that explosion?" "Must have been artillery." "No, it was one shot." From Bighgam. His sergeant, who once dismissed him as a dreamer, stood speechless. Even Lieutenant Colonel Harris, the man who'd sent Jack into the woods with little more than faith and a map, was stunned. That night, when Jack returned to base, his uniform reeked of gun oil and smoke. His fingers were cracked from the cold, his face streaked with mud. The men who had mocked his toy rifle now watched in silence as he laid it gently on the table. The steel ring mount was slightly bent, the lens fogged at the edges, but it had done what no regulation optic had ever done. No metals were pinned, no reporters took notes. But something changed. The laughter that used to follow him was gone, replaced by quiet respect, the kind that only soldiers understand. When the battalion intelligence officers called him in for debrief, Jack walked in holding his rifle and notebook. He explained everything: how he had dismantled the microscope into 3 parts, the objective lens, focus ring, and ocular. How he had painted the crosshair with a strand of wire from a field telephone. How he had tested, adjusted, and recalibrated every night for a week. The officers listened, really listened. They took notes, asked questions, and for the first time, saw his contraption not as a joke, but as innovation under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward. "Could you teach this?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Yes, sir." And that was how it began. Within days, men from neighboring companies came to see the scope that killed a tank. Some just wanted to hold it, to look through the lens that had seen the impossible. One corporal, still skeptical, muttered, "This thing's ugly." Then, after a pause, added, "But damn, it works." Jack smiled faintly. He didn't crave praise. He only wanted one thing: to make sure no soldier ever went blind on the battlefield again. What started as a laughable experiment in a muddy French forest was now spreading quietly across the division. In a war ruled by tanks, artillery, and machines, one young mechanic had reminded everyone of something the manuals forgot to teach: that ingenuity is a weapon too. The following week, Jack Bighgam found himself standing before a small group of riflemen under a tattered field tent. They were handpicked from across the 4th Infantry Division, men who had heard rumors about the kid with the homemade scope. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they didn't believe the story was real. Jack didn't care why they came. He only cared that they listened. He laid his rifle on a crate. Beside it, the scope, now darkened by frost, its metal edges dull from the blast that had shaken the ridge. "This," he said quietly, "isn't magic. It's math, patience, and trust in your own hands." He began explaining in the same calm, methodical way he had once fixed watches back in Kansas. How wind drift changed the bullet's path. How the cold could warp the metal and bend the zero. How a man's breath could ruin a shot if exhaled too quickly. Then he spoke about the part that wasn't in any manual. "The Army gives you a rifle," he said, "but sometimes the rifle isn't enough. Sometimes the thing that saves you isn't what you're issued, it's what you build when no one's watching." The men listened in silence. Some took notes. One sergeant, the same one who had once called him crazy, raised a hand. "You're telling us," he said, "you hit that tank because of this thing?" Jack shook his head. "No. I hit it because I knew where to aim. This rever today they 710 face." He went to the chalkboard, drew the shape of a Panzer IV, and circled the rear deck. "Armor's too thick here," he said, tapping the turret. "But here, the fuel intake, the spare cans, that's where the fire starts." It was the first time most of them had ever thought of a tank as something that could be defeated by a rifle. For the first time, they saw not just a machine, but its weaknesses and the mind of a man who had dared to find them. After the session ended, several soldiers stayed behind to look at his scope. They turned it in their hands, inspecting the rough solder marks, the uneven brackets, the hair-thin crosshair wire. It looked fragile, but when they peered through it, the world sharpened, magnified, steady, real. "This thing's ugly," one muttered again. "But damn, it works." Jack smiled faintly. He didn't correct them. He didn't explain how long it had taken him to make it. He simply nodded and said, "That's all that matters." Word spread fast. Within days, officers from nearby battalions requested demonstrations. One even sent a runner with a written note: "Request Private Biggam's presence for optical test." It wasn't an order, it was respect. He had started as the soldier everyone laughed at. Now, they called him something else. The man who made his own scope and changed the way they saw war. And somewhere in the quiet between drills, Jack realized a deeper truth: that in a world built on commands and conformity, his act of defiance had become its own kind of leadership. By late February 1945, the story of Jack Biggam's impossible shot had spread far beyond his battalion. Messengers carried fragments of it from outpost to outpost. A sniper hit a tank at 1,200 yards with a homemade scope. Each retelling grew slightly different, but the heart of the story stayed the same. A young mechanic had built what the Army couldn't supply and turned scrap metal into precision. Jack never saw himself as a legend. He still cleaned his rifle every night, wiping carbon from the bolt, polishing the lens with a cloth cut from his old uniform. When others congratulated him, he only said, "I just did my job." But deep down, he knew it wasn't just a shot. It was proof that even in the middle of chaos, one man's mind could still matter. The division staff soon called him in for a formal debrief. They wanted to understand how a broken microscope had become a weapon. The tent was packed: officers, engineers, even a few men from the logistics corps. Jack placed his rifle on the table and began to speak quietly. with the same calm he used to teach others. He showed them the notebook he'd kept filled with wind measurements, temperature drift notes, and hand-drawn diagrams of the Panzer IV's rear deck. He explained how he'd measured distance by shadow length, how he'd used fence posts to calculate angles, and how he'd compensated for a 3-degree slope across the valley floor. The officers nodded slowly. Some looked embarrassed, others simply stunned. When he finished, the room was silent for several seconds before Lieutenant Colonel Harris finally said, "You understand what you've done, Bighgam?" Jack shook his head. "I just built what I needed, sir." Harris smiled faintly. "No. You proved that initiative doesn't have to wait for permission." From that day, Jack was temporarily reassigned to Division Training Command. His job wasn't to fight, it was to teach. He trained small groups of riflemen from across the 4th Infantry Division, showing them how to read wind by the movement of grass, how to build stability with nothing but a rock and a sling, and how to aim not at what you see, but at what you know is there. His philosophy was simple: improvise with precision. Measure everything. Trust your instincts, but prove them with data. To most soldiers, it sounded like science. To Jack, it was survival. One evening, after training, a young private approached him and said, "Sir, I don't think I could ever do what you did." Jack smiled. "You don't have to. You just have to stop thinking you can't." That night, as he sat by the dim glow of a lantern, Jack opened his notebook again. On the corner of the page where he'd once scribbled firing distances, he wrote a single sentence. "It was never about the scope. It was about believing that I could make something better." In the months ahead, his lesson would ripple quietly through the ranks, inspiring not just snipers, but mechanics, engineers, and medics who began rethinking what standard issue really meant. Sometimes, the smallest invention in the mud can shift the thinking of an entire army. Jack Bighgam had just proven it. March 1945. The war was nearing its brutal end. Yet the lessons from the French forests had only just begun to take root. Jack Bighgam's name now traveled through the 4th Infantry Division like a quiet legend, not shouted in pride, but whispered in respect. Soldiers who had never met him passed on his story as if it were doctrine. If the manual fails, build your own. The Army never made it official, but change was already happening. Commanders started asking field units for reports on innovative practices. Engineers began visiting forward positions to observe improvised fixes, makeshift optics, modified tripods, repaired radios. Jack's one shot had cracked something open: the rigid belief that invention only came from the top. For Jack, the fame didn't matter. He was still the same quiet Kansan who spent nights cleaning his rifle by lantern light. The war had hardened many men, but it had refined him. Each time he looked through that bluish lens, he didn't see glory. He saw the faces of the men who doubted him, and the thin line between faith and failure. When April came, the division pushed farther east into Germany. Towns burned, resistance crumbled, and rumors spread that the Reich was collapsing. Jack rarely saw direct combat again. His days were filled with training new sharpshooters, sketching diagrams, and sharing what he'd learned from the battlefield. One afternoon, while walking through an abandoned German village, he found a shattered optical workshop. On the ground lay fragments of scopes, lenses, and adjustment rings, some stamped with the Zeiss logo, the pride of German optics. He picked one up, rolling the cold glass in his palm, and smiled to himself. It was perfect, flawless, machine-made, the kind of equipment his enemies had relied on. Yet he remembered how his own cracked microscope lens had done what none of these had. It had destroyed a tank and reshaped doctrine. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Perfection is not in the tool. It's in the will of the hand that holds it." The war ended a month later. Germany surrendered in May 1945. When the guns finally fell silent, Jack packed his Springfield M1903A4 and the battered homemade scope into his duffel bag. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt done. Back home in Marshall, Kansas, The quiet was almost unbearable. His parents met him at the station, tears in their eyes, pride in their hearts. But Jack couldn't quite adjust. The sound of engines, the echo of artillery, the smell of cordite, they lingered in his mind like ghosts. He returned to his old workshop, the one where he'd once repaired watches. The same tools still hung neatly on the wall. The same notebook sat open on the bench, a line penciled faintly across the page. 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. He ran his hand over it and smiled faintly. War had taken away much, but it had given him one unshakable truth, that even in destruction, creation is still possible. In the years that followed, Jack spoke rarely about the shot. When people asked, he would simply say, "I built something that worked when it shouldn't have. That's all. We will bet him. He will gift tend, but history has a way of remembering the quiet ones." And somewhere in the archives of the U.S. Army, buried inside an after-action report dated February 1945, a small handwritten note remains. Homemade optical device successfully engaged armored target at estimated 1,200 yards. Recommend further study. That note, unsigned and forgotten by most, was the echo of one man's defiance, proof that innovation doesn't wait for orders. Years passed. The noise of war faded, replaced by the hum of tractors and the whistle of freight trains crossing the plains of Kansas. Jack Bighgam blended back into civilian life, as if he'd never left. He opened a small repair shop on Main Street, fixing watches, radios, and sometimes the odd hunting rifle. People in town called him the man with the steady hands. Few remembered that those same hands had once guided a bullet across a mile of battlefield. The Springfield rifle and his handmade scope stayed locked in a cabinet behind his workbench. He rarely opened it, not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want the war to follow him home. Then, one autumn evening in 1953, Jack received a letter from a local veterans group. They were holding a gathering to honor the men of the 4th Infantry Division. Would he come? Would he tell his story? At first, he declined. He had no medals to show, no grand tales to tell. But something inside him, the same quiet resolve that once built a scope in the mud, told him it was time. When the day came, the hall was packed with gray uniforms and weathered faces. Jack arrived carrying a small wooden case. He set it on the podium and opened it slowly. Inside lay the rifle and the battered scope, still scratched and patched with wire. He looked up at the crowd. "This," he began softly, "isn't a weapon. It's a reminder." The room fell silent. He told them about those freezing nights in France, the laughter of his squad mates, and the shot that no one believed could be made. He didn't speak with pride. He spoke with reflection about fear, persistence, and the strange peace that comes when you trust your own hands more than the orders around you. When he finished, the audience didn't cheer. They stood in silence, hats in hand. An old sergeant from another company finally spoke. "You weren't fighting the Germans that day, son. You were fighting doubt." Afterward, a boy approached him, maybe 12 years old, the son of one of the veterans. "Sir," he asked shyly, "did they ever make more scopes like yours?" Jack smiled gently. "No," he said. "They made better men instead." That line stayed with everyone who heard it. It was printed later on a brass plaque beneath his display in the Kansas Military History Center, where his rifle and scope would one day rest. Decades later, military historians would rediscover his story, how a farm boy from Marshall had built a device that defied the odds and changed thinking on the battlefield. But Jack never sought recognition. To him, innovation was never about fame. It was about necessity, the will to make something work when the world around you is falling apart. And so, long after he was gone, visitors would lean over that glass case, read the small inscription, and whisper the same thought. This wasn't built in a lab. This was built by belief. By the 1,970 seconds, the world had changed, new wars, new machines, new generations of soldiers who had never known what it meant to fight in the mud with nothing but ingenuity and willpower. But somewhere in those training fields, the echo of Jack Bigham's story still lingered. Instructors in sniper schools told recruits about a Kansas mechanic who hit a Panzer from 3/4 of a mile with a homemade scope. The details blurred with time, but the message remained crystal clear. The best weapon is the mind that refuses to give up. Jack was now in his early 50s, his hair graying, his hands still steady. He had long retired from guns and glory, content repairing clocks and teaching local boys how to fix their bicycles. Then, one spring morning, a stranger arrived at his shop, a man in his 40s, wearing round glasses and carrying a stack of notebooks. "Mr. Bighgam," he said, "my name is Thomas Ridley. I'm a historian researching improvised weapons from the Second World War. I believe you built one of the most remarkable optical devices ever used in combat." Jack looked up, surprised. He hadn't heard anyone speak of that scope in decades. Ridley explained that he'd been combing through declassified field reports and found references to an unnamed soldier who had taken out a tank with a non-standard optic. When he tracked the serial numbers and unit records, they led him to one name, CPL, Jack R. Bighgam. Jack chuckled softly. "I never thought anyone would remember that." Ridley spent 2 days in Marshall, interviewing him. Jack told him everything: the field hospital, the microscope, the soldering, the testing, the cold. He brought out the rifle and the scope, both resting in a padded case lined with old flannel cloth. The historian examined them with reverence. The handmade reticle, the crude welds, the uneven bolts, every imperfection told a story. When Ridley asked what had kept him going, Jack answered simply, "Because I couldn't stand waiting for someone else to fix my problem." That line would later become the opening quote in Ridley's book, Tools of Last Resort. Ingenuity in Combat, 1978. One chapter was devoted entirely to Jack's story. The Kansas boy who changed the way soldiers thought about precision, improvisation, and courage. That same year, Jack donated the rifle and scope to the Kansas Military History Center. He didn't make a speech or call attention to it. He just left it with a note. It was never about the scope. It was about believing I could make something better. Today, the weapon sits inside a glass display case. Visitors often walk past without noticing, their eyes drawn instead to medals, flags, and photographs of generals. But those who lean closer see something different. A crude scope, a scratched barrel, a nameplate with only 5 words, "Built in war, born of belief." And in that moment, even without knowing the whole story, they understand. This wasn't about a shot fired in France. It was about the quiet defiance of one man who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. The decades rolled on, but Jack Biggam's single shot continued to echo far beyond the valley where it had been fired. Inside the U.S. Army archives, his report, once a footnote, became a source of quiet study. Officers began citing it in discussions on adaptive warfare, the idea that the battlefield rewards not just obedience, but invention. By the 1982nd, new manuals began to reflect that shift. Small paragraphs in sniper and reconnaissance guides mentioned targeting exposed auxiliary systems on armored vehicles, and field improvisation of optical aids. They never mentioned Jack by name, but those lines were his legacy. The Kansas mechanic's spirit had shaped doctrine. Meanwhile, Jack lived out his remaining years quietly. Every morning, he still opened his shop at sunrise, the smell of oil and dust greeting him like an old friend. He still carried his army notebook in his pocket, the corners frayed, the pencil marks fading. Sometimes, when customers came in to fix a watch or an old radio, he'd glance toward the glass cabinet where his rifle once sat in the museum and think, maybe it's better there. Maybe things we build to survive don't belong in homes, they belong in stories. In 1984, the Army invited him to a symposium on battlefield innovation at Fort Benning, the same place he had trained 40 years earlier. He almost didn't go, but when he did, he was met with a standing ovation from a room filled with engineers, snipers, and officers who had grown up hearing about his shot. A colonel introduced him simply. "Gentlemen, this is what happens when courage meets craftsmanship." Jack didn't give a long speech. He only said, "I'm not special. I just stopped waiting for better tools." The room fell quiet. For soldiers who had spent their lives following procedure, that sentence hit harder than any metal could. That night, one young sniper trainee approached him outside the hall. "Sir," he said, "what do you think matters most in a shot like yours, skill or belief?" They were not if he didn't count it. Jack smiled gently, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "Belief," he said. "Skill makes you accurate. Belief makes you take the shot." Those words would later be engraved beneath his name in the museum. He passed away quietly a few years later, in his sleep, surrounded by the same peace that had guided him in the chaos of war. But even after his death, his influence endured. Sniper schools across America began teaching a small exercise called the Bighgam drill, a test of creativity under pressure, where students were asked to build an aiming device using only scrap material. The point wasn't to fire perfectly. It was to think perfectly, to understand that every problem, no matter how impossible, has a solution if you're willing to build it yourself. And somewhere, beneath the glass of that Kansas museum, the light still catches the cracked lens of Jack's homemade scope, a faint blue shimmer, as if the sky of that February morning in 1945 still lives inside it. It's been nearly 80 years since the shot that silenced the laughter. The war that forged Jack Bighgam's legend has long passed into history books, and the soldiers who once walked beside him now exist only in fading photographs. Yet, in every corner of military education, from sniper schools to engineering corps, his story continues to breathe. In modern warfare classrooms, instructors often begin a lesson with a question. Who decides what's possible, the manual or the man holding the rifle? Then they tell the story of a two-year-old farm mechanic from Kansas who refused to accept the limits of his tools. They talk about the microscope lens, the soldered ring of a German shell, and the scratch-built crosshair made from a telephone wire. And finally, they play the grainy black-and-white footage of Epernay's Valley, where a single flash of fire once turned ridicule into respect. To new generations, it's not just a war story, it's a blueprint for mindset. They learn that precision is not born from perfection, but from persistence. That innovation doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it hides behind quiet men who build in the dark. Historians now call Jack Biggam's feat the shot that rewrote doctrine. The Army's post-war field manuals, the push for standardized optics, even the birth of modern sniper schools, each traces a small line back to that February afternoon in 1945. And though his name rarely appears in official documents, his fingerprints are everywhere, in every soldier trained to adapt, every engineer taught to think creatively, every leader told to listen to ideas that sound crazy at first. At the Kansas Military History Center, visitors still stop before the glass case. The rifle rests on a bed of dark velvet. The scope's cracked lens catches the overhead light, reflecting a soft blue glow. Beside it, a plaque bears the words Jack once said to the boy at the Veterans Hall. "They never built more scopes like mine. They built better men instead." People read the inscription, pause, and nod, because they know the truth hidden inside those words, that sometimes greatness isn't about glory. It's about one man's refusal to give up when every rule told him he should. In a world now filled with precision machines, computer-guided weapons, and digital sights, Jack's story still whispers a challenge to those who listen. When the tools fail, when the odds mock you, when everyone says it can't be done, pick up what's broken and make it work anyway. His single shot didn't just destroy a tank. It pierced the heart of complacency itself. And that's why generations later, soldiers, builders, and dreamers alike still look at that battered scope and see something more than steel and glass. They see proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply looks through a cracked lens and never misses.